Hey guys, so recently a viewer, Jonathan, asked me a very innocent question. How do you turn off a Sonos speaker? Well, you can't. You plug it in the wall, it turns on. If you want to turn it off, you pull out the plug from the wall. So that got me thinking, maybe I shouldn't be keeping my Sonos speakers on round the clock. So the question today is, should you turn off your Sonos speakers when they're not in use? Let's find out. So in my usual fashion, I like to give my answers up front. And the answer is yes, you should be turning off your Sonos speakers when you're not using them. Well, at least during the extended times that you're definitely not going to be using them, like when you're out at work or when you're sleeping at night. And the reason is because even in power saving mode, idle power consumption is actually pretty substantial on these devices. Not that each device draws a lot of power, but over hours in a day and days in a month and months in a year, it all adds up pretty quickly. Now I have a device here that can measure the power draw from the wall of any device that I plug into it. I've tested this with the Sonos Gear before and I am confident that it is relatively accurate. But instead of testing all the devices one by one, I did a quick search online and found a shortcut to all the answers that I want right on the Sonos website itself. And I present this idle power consumption chart to you. Sonos kind of grouped them by device type, so you have all the speakers coming up first, followed by the home theater soundbars, and then the components like the Sonos amp, followed by the subs, and finally the connectivity devices. Now I won't go through the figures one by one, you can read them for yourself right here, but I like to point out that if you are on a 110 volts power grid, you are blessed with a lower power consumption. Now I'm on the 230 volts power grid and I get about a 10% hit in terms of idle power consumption. But maybe that means that my speakers are drawing higher power and sounds better. Kidding, I don't think so. But maybe. I don't know. So for the purpose of today's discussion, I'm going to be looking at the 230 volts power column. In general, the speakers are fairly thrifty in terms of power consumption, with the most efficient being the Play Fives Gen 2, coming in at about 2.2 watts. The older Gen 1s are drawing 8 watts, which is pretty obscene considering that that can power almost 4 of the Gen 2s on standby. The new Sonos Fives here comes in at about 3.1 watt, which is reasonable. The older Play 3s are at 4.4 watts, which seems to indicate that the older devices aren't as power efficient as the newer folks. And talk about the newer speakers, I find it strange that the One SL actually draws the same power as the Gen 2 of the Sonos One. Now logically speaking, without a mic and without having the power and always on internet connection, the SLs should be drawing less power. Well, unless they are actually just disabling the feature, but the hardware and the logic board and the mics, they're all still inside the One SL and still active. Now, amongst the home theater products, the relatively new Beam and the oldest Play Bar both clocks in at 6.1 watt. Now, I would have thought that the smaller sound bar, the Beam, and the newer tech should draw less power in either mode, but then again, the Beam has the mic array for the smart assistant function. I wouldn't read too much into it. Special mention to the Play Bass clocking in at only 3 watts. The Arc sits somewhere in the middle at about 4.4 watts. And considering that it is almost twice the number of drivers over the Beam and also the smart assistant function, 4.4 watts is pretty impressive. The amp is actually a very powerful amplifier and I'm not surprised that it actually draws pretty high power in idle mode. Now I really have to consider turning that guy off when it's not in use. The rest of the devices are okay, but I'd like to bring your attention to the sub. The sub Gen 2 and the sub Gen 3 both clock in at 3.8 watts in standby mode. But earlier I told you that I have this power consumption device, and when I plug this into the sub Gen 2, it checks out and the idle power draw is about 3.8 watts, but the Sonos Sub Gen 3 actually clocks in at about 3.2 watts on this device. Now recently I did a comparison video on the Sonos Sub Gen 2 and the Sub Gen 3. If you're keen in the video, I'm linking it up here. In that video, I also have highlighted that the weight of the sub between the Gen 2 and the Gen 3 is completely different. Sonos lists both subs to weigh exactly the same. The sub Gen 3 is much lighter, and they didn't bother updating the weight on their website. So I'm not sure if they are really bothered to update the power rating of the sub Gen 3 in the idle mode here. Now, to give you an understanding of my earlier recommendation of turning off Sonos speakers, let me give you a little bit of background on my situation. I have 11 Sonos devices at home. I have a pair of Play 1s, a pair of Play 3s, a pair of Sonos Fives, a Sonos M, a Sonos Beam, a Sonos Arc, and a sub Gen 2 and a sub Gen 3. Now, you've seen the chart that I've copied from the Sonos site earlier, and then I'm applying all the power consumption figures here into my chart. And if you tally up all the figures here, it adds up to 48 watts. Now, it may not sound like much, but remember, they are all sitting idle and not doing anything for you. Then you consider the fact that there are 24 hours in a day, which brings the total power draw to 1.14 kilowatts a day. And consider the fact that there are 365 days in a year, which brings this figure up to a staggering 416 kilowatts. Now that is enough to power a kettle, boiling water for 10 hours straight without ever turning it off. Now one has to consider two cost factors here. First is the financial impact. Electricity costs about 20 cents here, equivalent to 14 cents in US dollars. The cost of leaving the Sonos speakers turned on throughout the year is 83 Singapore dollars. That's 58 US dollars a year, just leaving them idle. Now the second cost to consider is the environmental impact. The amount of carbon emission per kilowatt of electricity generated, it depends on a few factors, such as how the electricity is generated, whether is it by burning coal or petroleum, or is it solar or wind power. But if I could average the sources out and give an estimate, it would be about £1 per kilowatt hour that's being used. So the calculation is simple. Keeping my Sonos speakers powered throughout the day, in a year, I would have contributed 416 pounds of greenhouse gases into the air. And all that when I'm not deriving any benefits from them when they're sitting idle. Now you'd like to ask, are there any benefits of leaving the speakers on? Maybe it's a bit harsh to say that they're completely idle. I do use Google Assistant, and if you are like me and have smart lights and devices around the house, having voice control is useful. I do also pipe in music on demand when I feel like a specific song. Sometimes I even play them as background music when I'm working alone at home. Now, having music on tap feels good. And sometimes you just think of something and you want to listen to it when the mood strikes. And if you do use Sonos speakers as an alarm anywhere in the house, you want to keep them turned on and powered on as well. But the truth is, more often than not, they are sitting idle. And there are times when I'm out of the house and when I'm asleep, there's absolutely no reason for me to keep them powered on. So while the benefits are there, I'm not sure if the environmental impact is worth that amount of convenience. So now I am a man on a mission. I want to be able to solve this issue. I'll be getting myself a couple of timer switches and set them up so that when I'm asleep, the speakers go to sleep too. If I'm at work, I want to time it as such as well. And if there's no one else at home for a while, I want the timer switch to know and turn off the speakers to save on the electricity. And when I get home, I want the speakers to turn on and be ready to accept a command. Now this is going to be my project for the Sonos setup that I have at home. I'll be keeping you informed of that project if you are keen. Now do let me know in the comment section below if you'd like a follow-up on this video. And while you're at it, let us know as well which camp you belong to. Do you leave your Sonos speakers plugged in and powered on all the time? Or do you only turn it on when you're going to be using it? I'd like to know that I'm not alone. Okay, and the next video that I'll be having is actually a very exciting one. I'll be measuring the full power draw of a Sonos 2020 full home theater setup with the Sonos Arc with a sub Gen 3 paired with the Sonos Fives as the surround speakers. Now, if you're interested in the maximum power draw of the most powerful setup from Sonos in 2020, do stay tuned. Now, if you have enjoyed this video and found it useful, do consider subscribing to this channel where I talk about wireless audio products. Now, that's all I have for today's discussion, and I'll see you in my next video.